It took just one plate, one name, and one look. J.D. Vance stepped into the diner like any other man, until he wasn't. 14 people went silent. Conversations stalled mid-sentence. The clink of cutlery stopped cold. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s. Her apron was worn, her eyes steady. She'd lost someone years ago, to a policy, not a bullet, and today the man she held responsible had walked into her world. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't curse. She simply turned the plate over, gently, and said, "We don't serve forgetfulness here." That's when the boy by the kitchen door, flowers still on his arms, stepped forward. What he did next wasn't planned. It wasn't safe, but it echoed through headlines, through homes, through a country still asking, how far would you go for someone you never met? And though this story is imagined, its heartbeat is not. The diner may be fictional, the names may change, but the grief, the courage, the reckoning are all too real. Sometimes the stories that didn't happen tell us the most about the world we live in. Don't blink. What happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The rain had been falling since dawn, soaking the cracked black top of the Circun 71 overpass and tracing long silver veins down the windows of Loretta's Grill, a small-town diner with a chipped neon sign that hadn't fully lit up in years. The O and open flickered, undecided. Inside, the air smelled of black coffee and fried onions. Old Springsteen hummed low from a dusty jukebox. A waitress wiped down a laminated table with the same practiced motion she'd done for 20 years. It was the kind of place where the booths were worn soft from elbows and regulars had their seats long before sunrise. And that morning, something shifted. The bell above the door let out a tired jingle. A man stepped in, soaked at the shoulders, trench coat creased from the road. No cameras, no aides. Just a faint, familiar silhouette, one you'd recognize from a debate stage, or a headline, or a quote that had gone viral for all the wrong reasons. J.D. Vance. A hush rolled through the diner like someone had hit pause. Forks stopped halfway to mouths. A man in a neon construction vest lowered his coffee slowly. A teen behind the register blinked twice, as if trying to match the real man with the version from the internet. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just walked in, quietly like a man who knew he wasn't welcome, but came anyway. There were no TV crews this time, no podium, just him, and a battered diner booth in a town that hadn't trusted anyone in a suit since the local plant shut down in '98. J.D. paused at the entrance like he was measuring something. Air pressure, maybe, or judgment. He picked the corner booth, by the window but facing the room. Smart. As he slid into the seat, someone in the back muttered, "You've got to be kidding me." Another voice, low but sharp. "Loretta's? Really, after everything?" J.D. didn't flinch. His eyes scanned the room, slow, deliberate, like a man checking for landmines under a Sunday carpet. He cleared his throat. "Could I see a menu, please?" Nobody moved. The waitress, Marlene, according to the faded gold script on her tag, stood frozen with a pot of coffee hovering over a half-filled mug. She didn't look at him, not directly. The silence stretched long. The rain outside picked up, tapping harder on the windows, like it too was waiting for a reply. A kid near the kitchen peeked out, a young cook with flour smudges on his cheek, barely 20. His eyes narrowed, not in anger, but something else. Caution, memory, maybe both. J.D. adjusted his cuff. A simple gesture, but it betrayed nerves. He wasn't here to make a scene. That much was clear. But why was he here? Nobody asked. And yet, everyone wondered. Someone whispered, "He voted against it, and now he wants eggs?" Another voice, "My brother lost his benefits because of him." A spoon clinked against ceramic. J.D. shifted again, this time slower, as if he heard every word, felt every stare, and still, no menu came. The tension didn't boil over. It simmered, hot and quiet, the kind that cooks something you can't scrape off the pan. Then finally Marlene set down the coffee pot, wiped her hands and walked over. She didn't bring a menu, just a rag to dry the table that didn't need drying. She looked down at him, not angry, not warm, just tired, And then, just above a whisper, she said, "We don't serve forgetfulness here." The rag she used to dry the table wasn't wet, just something to hold, something to do with her hands when words alone weren't enough. Then from behind the kitchen door, a voice called softly, "Loretta, is everything okay?" The woman stepped out. She wasn't tall, but she moved with the quiet authority of someone who'd run a place like this long before Yelp existed. Gray streaks ran through her dark braid, and her apron bore the faint embroidered initials, G.L. George and Loretta, a name she hadn't heard said together in public in almost 10 years. Loretta looked at J.D., not like a celebrity, not like a senator. She looked at him the way someone looks at a man who accidentally walks into the room where the grief still sleeps. She didn't flinch. She walked forward, slow and measured. As she passed the counter, a trucker lifted his mug, then lowered it again. Nobody sipped. Nobody blinked too long. J.D. stood up out of habit. Out of respect, maybe. But Loretta didn't offer her hand. Her voice, when it came, was even, not cruel, but laced with something heavier than anger. "You're J.D. Vance." He nodded once. "You came in real quiet, like maybe you knew." She didn't say what he knew, but he did. Loretta didn't sit. She looked down at the booth, then back at him. "My husband, George," she said. 34 years at the steel mill. Didn't want a plaque. Didn't want a fuss. Just wanted to fish on Sundays and make it to 70. J.D. didn't speak. He waited. Loretta's eyes didn't soften. When the plant closed, they said the pensions were safe, said the vote wouldn't touch his generation, but 2 years later it was all amended language and revised eligibility. She took a breath. Steady. "He died before we could hire a lawyer." A muscle in J.D.'s jaw tensed, briefly, then gone. Loretta looked around the room once, then back at him. "We serve everyone here. Truckers, teachers, kids who can't pay till Friday." She paused. "But we don't serve what your policies did to people like him." The words didn't need to be shouted. They landed harder in silence. J.D. held her gaze. For a long moment, neither of them moved. And then quietly, "I understand," he said. "And I'm sorry." Loretta blinked once. That was all. He reached for his coat, folded it over his arm. "Thank you," J.D. added, "for being honest." She stepped aside, saying nothing. He walked past the booths, past the glances that had turned into stares, past the memory of a man he never knew, but whose name had been buried by a vote he did cast. The bell above the door jingled again, quieter this time. Rain was still falling outside, harder now. And inside Loretta's grill, the silence stayed, not angry, not relieved, just full, with something that had needed to be said, and finally was. From behind the swinging door that separated heat from hush, Jonah stood still, half hidden by a rack of clean plates, a smear of flour still on his sleeve, apron string fraying at the hip. He wasn't supposed to stop, wasn't supposed to care. Orders were piling, timer was blinking, and yet he couldn't take his eyes off the man in the booth. He'd known who J.D. was the second he walked in, not because of headlines or politics. Jonah didn't follow that world. He followed people. And the way the room had stiffened said more than any article ever could. He saw how Loretta stood straighter than usual, how Marlene's hand trembled when she wiped the table, how every voice dropped into that peculiar silence, the kind that only settles when something uninvited walks in. From Jonah's vantage point, J.D. wasn't a senator, wasn't a bestseller, wasn't even the guy from the internet. He was just a man who walked in alone and was now walking out the same way, slower, heavier, and something about that shook Jonah more than he expected. He'd been raised to spot weakness, not to exploit it, but to avoid it. You see the droop in the shoulder, the breath that catches too long. You step back, you stay quiet, let trouble pass. And yet, as J.D. neared the door, he glanced sideways. Just a flicker, barely a second. But their eyes met. It wasn't recognition, it wasn't apology, it was something simpler, something equal. A look that said, "I don't know your story, but I know it's not easy." Jonah's fingers tightened around the dish towel. Because JD didn't see him as a kitchen boy, didn't see the hand-me-down shoes, or the second shift high school classes, or the letters he never mailed because he wasn't sure if anyone cared. He just saw him, and for some reason Jonah couldn't explain, not even to himself, he felt seen in return. The bell above the door gave one last chime. JD stepped into the rain. Jonah stayed there, unmoving, staring at the empty booth, at the coffee that had never been poured, at the tension that had come and gone like thunder in the distance. He thought about how easy it would have been for JD to raise his voice, to demand service, to pull rank. But he hadn't. He'd taken the words, taken the weight, and left it behind, like someone who knew he deserved more anger than he got. And somehow that lingered longer than any speech ever would. Jonah didn't tell anyone what he saw, didn't rush out, didn't post about it. But that night, when the last dish was scrubbed and the kitchen light clicked off, he walked home a different way. Past the town library, past the empty bus stop, past the mural on 3rd Street that said, "Hard work builds tomorrow." And for the first time in months, Jonah thought maybe, just maybe, tomorrow was still something he could build. Even if no one believed it yet. That look from JD lingered longer than Jonah expected. Not as a judgment, but as a mirror. And as the kitchen door swung shut behind him, another one creaked open inside Jonah. The door to everything he had buried just to survive. Most mornings, Jonah woke to the soft rattle of the motel ice machine and the muffled arguments of the couple in 2B. The wallpaper near the window had peeled so far it curled like bark, and the mini fridge made a noise every hour that sounded like it was choking on its own breath. But at least the lock worked, and the second drawer kept his mom's medications cool enough. He never planned to end up here, working double shifts at Loretta's Grill, sleeping 4 miles from where he was born, stuck in the same town that had run out of jobs before it ran out of teenagers, with dreams. But cancer doesn't care about scholarships. He had been 1 semester from finishing culinary school in Columbus. 1 semester. His knives were still wrapped in the roll his uncle gave him. He hadn't touched them since the day he left campus, called by the kind of phone call you only get once in your life, and pray never comes again. His mother had cried when he came home, said he should have stayed, said she'd figure it out, but she was already too tired to stand more than 10 minutes at a time. And he knew her insurance didn't cover the new drug, the one they said might give her another year, maybe 2. So he stayed. The high school trophy still sat in the corner of the motel nightstand, half buried under pill bottles and instant noodle wrappers. Tri-State Culinary Showcase, 1st place. He remembered that day like a sunbeam you can't recapture, his hands trembling but precise, slicing onions into threads so fine they vanished on the tongue. The judges were stunned. The applause had been real. One had even leaned in and whispered, "You've got it, kid." He did, or he had. Now he chopped onions for chili specials and poured fries from frozen bags into fryers that hissed like they hated him. The rhythm was predictable, the praise non-existent. Customers didn't look at the kitchen. They looked past it, at best. But for Jonah, food was still sacred, a language he could still speak, even if no one listened. When his hands moved across the cutting board, something in the world aligned. The chaos faded. The motel walls fell away. His mother's shallow breaths, the bills taped to the mirror, the ache in his spine. All of it softened beneath the weight of garlic, heat, and timing. Still, every day felt like stitching together a dream with thread that frayed too fast. That morning after JD Vance left, Jonah had come back into the kitchen and stared at his reflection in the walk-in cooler door. He looked the same, grease-stained, bone-tired. But something in his chest felt louder. Not angry, not hopeful exactly, but seen. JD had looked at him, really looked, and hadn't judged the hairnet or the apron or the way Jonah leaned forward like he was always bracing for bad news. It didn't fix anything, but it made something small inside him sit up straighter. By the end of the shift, he didn't say much. Just rinsed the dishes, scrubbed the flat top, and turned off the fryer with a bit more care than usual. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the streets still shimmered like the town hadn't decided what kind of day it wanted to be. Neither had Jonah, but something told him tomorrow might be different. The next morning, Jonah showed up to the diner an hour before his shift. No one else was there. The chairs were still flipped onto tables, and the coffee pot hadn't started its first drip. But the kitchen was waiting, quiet, expectant, like it remembered him. He didn't know exactly why he came early. Maybe it was the look JD gave him. Maybe it was the fact that nobody else had. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in months, he wasn't just surviving the day. He was thinking about doing something in it. He stood over the prep counter, arms crossed, staring at the bins of scraps most cooks tossed without blinking. Carrot tops, roasted garlic cores, a heel of burnt bread, a splash of vinegar someone forgot to label. The things that didn't belong in any recipe. The leftovers of a place that didn't believe in second chances. He lined them up like puzzle pieces and started moving. No timer, no recipe, just instinct and memory of school kitchens, of street vendors, of the way his mother used to stir peanut butter into broth when the pantry ran dry. The sauce took form in silence. It smelled like roasted heat and something almost floral. It shimmered with oil but finished with smoke. He dipped a spoon, tasted, paused. It didn't taste like anything he knew. It didn't even taste like him. It tasted like a door cracking open. Later that night, during the slowest hour, when the dinner rush had passed and the town fell into its TV blue hush, a man in a gray windbreaker walked in. He looked like someone who didn't want to be remembered. Clean hands, quiet shoes, a leather notebook tucked under his arm. He ordered the special. Didn't speak much, didn't smile, but when the plate came out, Jonah added a swirl of the sauce he hadn't named. Just a drizzle, almost like an afterthought. The man took one bite, then another, then set his fork down. He didn't finish the meal. Just closed his notebook, left a 20 on the counter, and slid a card under the empty plate. No fanfare, no questions. Jonah watched from the kitchen as the man left, still unsure if he was a health inspector, a critic, or just someone who wanted to sit in silence. Only later, as he wiped the counter and picked up the card, did his stomach twist. It read, Ashbridge Foundation. Beneath it, a name he didn't recognize, and one line, handwritten in ink, just crooked enough to feel human. We saw something worth investing in. Jonah stared at it for a long time, not because he understood what it meant, but because it felt like the first time anyone had ever said we and worth in the same sentence about him. He turned the card over once, then again, then slipped it into his pocket, like it might vanish if he looked too long. In the sink behind him, the spoon he'd stirred with was still sticky with the sauce he couldn't name. The envelope was plain, no wax seal, no letterhead, just a cream-colored rectangle tucked into the door frame of Jonah's motel room. He nearly missed it when leaving for work. It had his name, handwritten, nothing more. No one in town called him Mr. Harris, but there it was, Mr. Jonah Harris in a looping script that looked like it belonged to another life. He opened it sitting on the bus, knees tight to his chest, fingers cold from the night air. Inside, an invitation. Ashbridge Culinary Forum, Regional Trial Series. One day, all ingredients provided, transportation arranged, portfolio optional, presence required. There was a phone number, no explanation. For a moment, Jonah forgot where he was. The rattle of the bus, the glare of its overhead lights, the rubber squeal at every turn, all of it blurred. His thumb hovered over the number. He didn't press it. He didn't have to. When he arrived at Loretta's grill an hour later, Loretta was already waiting at the back door, arms crossed. The news had gotten ahead of him. "How long have you been planning this?" she asked. Jonah blinked. "Planning what?" She held up the card from the recruiter, crumpled slightly now from someone else's fingers. "Don't play dumb, Jonah. You think I don't know what's going on? That sauce stunt? The anonymous guest? You turned my diner into someone else's redemption tour." "It wasn't a stunt," Jonah said quietly. "No? Then what was it?" "You knew who he was. You think that man just wandered in off the highway by accident? You think I'm too small town to notice when my own kitchen's being used to score points for politicians trying to look good?" Jonah didn't raise his voice. He never did. "I didn't ask him to come. I didn't even talk to him." Loretta stepped closer, eyes sharp. "But you sure let him look at you like you were some symbol. You let him turn you into a damn headline. And now you're leaving. Just like that?" Jonah held the invitation in both hands like it might tear under the weight of her words. "I'm not leaving," he said. "I'm just showing up." "To what? A circus for donors?" "To a kitchen," Jonah answered, slower now. "A real one, where I might matter." Loretta's voice dropped to a bitter whisper. "You already do matter here." He nodded once. "Then let me try. Let me fail on my own dime." A silence stretched between them, tight, aching, like a wire pulled too far. Loretta turned away first. "Clock in," she muttered, "before I change my mind." He did. The rest of the shift passed like a blur. Jonah moved through it with practiced precision, but his hands trembled slightly when no one was looking. He didn't mention the invitation again. Neither did she. But later that night, as he left the diner and stepped out into the misty dark, he pulled the envelope from his pocket and pressed the card flat against his palm. He didn't know if he belonged in a room like that, but for once he wasn't afraid of finding out. Loretta never checked her email before the morning coffee. It was a rule she made for herself long ago, back when her husband was still alive, when they ran the diner side by side and believed in simple beginnings. But today something tugged. Maybe it was the way Jonah had moved around the kitchen yesterday, quieter than usual, like something had cracked inside him. She opened her laptop behind the register before the morning rush. There it was. Subject line, "With gratitude, Ashbridge Culinary Forum." The sender was formal, polite. Someone named Deirdre from an outreach department. It opened with a thank you to Loretta's Grill for unknowingly providing the stage for a young talent to emerge. A line she had to read twice. They went on to praise Jonah's flavor instincts. "Our team was deeply impressed. It's not often we see such raw intuition from someone who never completed formal training." Loretta's heart tightened. She would have smiled maybe, would have felt proud maybe. But then she saw it. C:"J.D. Vance, Senator, State of Ohio." Her hands went cold. For a moment the screen blurred. She leaned back in her chair and stared. The name sat there like an oil stain on linen, unmovable, quietly ruining everything beneath it. It wasn't the fact that JD had been involved. She had suspected something. Suspected it the moment Jonah started acting like a man with something to lose. It was the way they framed it. Unknowingly providing the stage? That word again. Stage. As if her diner had become someone else's backdrop. As if the story didn't belong to her anymore. Loretta closed the laptop with more force than necessary. A ceramic mug on the counter trembled, but didn't fall. In the kitchen, she stirred batter harder than usual. Eggs cracked too sharply. Flour dusted her apron like smoke. But it wasn't the kitchen she saw. It was her husband years ago, in that same booth J.D. Vance had sat in. Quiet, proud, saying, "We don't serve power here. We serve people." He died too early, left her with a diner, a mortgage, and a town that kept forgetting it once stood for something. And now even that space, her space, had been rewritten into someone else's act of redemption. A footnote in someone else's spotlight. Behind her, the bell on the front door jingled. The morning crowd, voices calling out for coffee, bacon, extra syrup. Loretta wiped her hands and put on her best face. But something inside had already changed. Something she couldn't quite name yet. Anger, sure, but also grief. Grief that J.D. Vance had walked in without asking. Grief that Jonah had walked towards something without telling her. Grief that the world kept spinning stories around her, but never for her. She poured coffee like she always did, smiled like she always did, but the edges of her smile didn't quite reach where they used to. The smell of onions sizzling in oil filled the kitchen. It was mid-shift, and the grill hissed with each drop of butter. Jonah stood at the counter, chopping parsley, trying to steady his breath. Ever since the email, Loretta had said nothing to him, not even her usual half-joking, "Try not to burn down my kitchen" that always opened the day. But today there was only silence. And silence, Jonah had learned, was never just silence with Loretta. It was pressure, waiting. He didn't hear her footsteps, only felt the shadow. When he looked up, she was there. Arms crossed, face unreadable, jaw set like a lock on a door that refused to open. "You think I'm stupid?" she said flatly. Jonah blinked. "What? You think I don't know what this is?" Her voice was low, firm, like a match just before it sparks. A little PR stunt? You and that senator staging some redemption act in my diner? He dropped the knife, the blade clinking against the cutting board. No, Loretta, I didn't even... Don't lie to me. Her voice cracked, just once. He shows up here, sits in that booth. You look at him like he's your savior. And now you're getting trial offers, culinary forums, from foundations that don't even know we exist? Her words hit like a slap that never touched skin. Jonah stepped back. I didn't know who he was, not that night. He meant it, and it came out quieter than he'd intended. I saw a man walking out of here in silence, he continued, and not one of us, not one, asked why. We just let it happen. Loretta's jaw trembled, but her arms stayed folded. That's not your story to tell. Jonah's voice rose, not loud but firm. Then whose is it? Yours? Mine? Or is it just the next one to spin it fastest for the cameras? He stepped closer, eyes searching hers. I didn't cook that dish for a foundation. I didn't invent that sauce for a resume. I did it because, for the first time in a long time, I remembered why I started. Loretta didn't respond. I'm not with them, he added, voice softening. I'm just a guy whose mom is dying in a motel bed, who wakes up every day hoping the walk to work won't be the last thing I do right. The kitchen grew still. Even the grill seemed to quiet, as if it too were listening. I didn't ask for a stage, he finished. I just want a chance. For a long moment, Loretta didn't move. Then she slowly uncrossed her arms and turned away, brushing past the swinging door without a word. Jonah stood alone, chest heaving, unsure if he'd just burned a bridge, or finally told the truth that had been boiling under his skin for years. He picked up the knife. The parsley needed finishing, but his hands were shaking. The clock on the wall blinked 3:07 a.m. The kitchen was dark, save for the faint orange hum from the prep light above the steel counter. Jonah stood alone, his apron folded neatly beside him, the soft scratch of pen on paper breaking the silence. He had rewritten the letter 5 times already. Each version was either too formal or too emotional. Until now, this version was just honest. Loretta, you gave me a place to survive. I want to learn how to live. Thank you. Jonah. He placed the folded paper on the prep table, just beneath the spice rack they built together his first week. He glanced around the kitchen, every dent in the fridge door, every scratch on the cutting board, ghosts of burnt sauces, slammed pans, shouted orders, midnight meals alone. This place had saved him once, but staying now would be like treading water with lungs too full to breathe. He took one last look, turned off the light, and stepped out into the cold. By morning, the sun was barely stretching over the rooftops. The diner's parking lot was empty, mist rising from the asphalt. Jonah approached the back entrance to drop off his key. As he reached the door, he saw it, an envelope taped to the knob. No name, no address, just one word, handwritten across the front, Jonah. He stood there for a moment, the envelope in his hand, heart thudding. The paper was thick, linen texture. Someone had taken their time. He opened it. Inside was a single cream-colored note card. You have more in you than you think. Vance Foundation. Beneath the line was a watermark seal, faint but unmistakable, and a phone number, with the words, Next Round, Culinary Innovation Series, Ashbridge Campus. Jonah stared. It didn't say congratulations. It didn't offer money or guarantees, just belief. Quiet, precise belief. His first instinct was to run inside, to find Loretta, to tell her everything. But something stopped him. Not guilt, not fear, respect. This part, this leap, had to be his alone. He stepped back from the door and looked up at the sky. For the first time in years, it wasn't just the clouds he noticed. It was the space between them. He slipped the card into his pocket, turned toward the road, and began walking. Not fast, not slow, just forward. Every step felt like something new was starting, and he didn't know what it was. But for the first time, not knowing didn't scare him. The kitchen at Ashbridge Campus wasn't like Loretta's. It was colder, sleeker. Every counter gleamed. Every blade was perfectly honed. There were no cracked tiles, no hum of old fridges, No greasy notes taped to the wall that read, "Don't burn the toast again." This was the kind of place that expected precision. Clean hands, straight backs, confidence. Jonah stood in the far left station, a white apron crisp against his black shirt. Around him, 7 other contestants were unpacking. Duck breast, black garlic, truffle oil. Some were chefs from boutique restaurants. Others wore the look of culinary school pride. One even had their knives rolled in monogrammed leather. Jonah carried his in a cloth grocery bag. He didn't bring foie gras or imported uni, no dry-aged ribeye or liquid nitrogen. Just what fit in his tote. Shallots, cream, old cheddar, potatoes, a sealed jar of homemade tomato preserves, and a single plastic bag of rotini, the kind his mom used to buy in bulk when they had $5 in a dream. As the bell rang to signal the start, others lunged for the fire like it was war. Jonah paused. He reached into his tote and pulled out a small photograph. His mother, age 31, grinning through a chemo scarf, holding a paper plate of what she used to call Jonah's firehouse pasta. It was the first dish he'd ever cooked for her when she was too weak to stand. The sauce too peppery, the cheese too lumpy, but she ate it like it had been plated at the Ritz. Today he wasn't going to reinvent the wheel. He was going to remember who taught him why food mattered. Jonah sliced the shallots slowly, evenly, letting the scent of butter fill the sterile air. He simmered the tomatoes down with cracked pepper and a touch of vinegar, then stirred in cream until the sauce turned soft orange. Sunset in a saucepan. He added garlic, then the cheddar, grated with careful strokes. Every swirl of the spoon felt like a whisper to the past. "You're still here. I haven't forgotten." Others were flambeing, glazing, using tweezers to place edible flowers. Jonah didn't even garnish. He plated the dish with a humble sprig of basil, torn by hand. Rotini curled in a small pool of sauce. A dish that didn't scream for applause but waited for memory to do the talking. He looked at the plate the way someone looks at a sealed letter. Something sacred, maybe final. A judge walked over, balding, stern. No words. Just took the plate and nodded. Jonah stepped back. His hands didn't shake, but his chest did. He didn't care if he won. Not really. This wasn't about advancement or proving himself. It was about giving something of his life, raw, unscripted, to a room that had never seen him before. He looked up at the kitchen ceiling, half expecting to see that flickering light bulb from Loretta's kitchen. But the light here was clean, constant, no flicker. Still, in his heart, he heard it. That one voice. "You gave me a place to survive. Now I want to live." And this dish was the first thing he'd ever made, not because someone asked him to, but because someone once believed he could. The flyer went up 3 days before the event, printed on cheap paper, tacked crooked to the bulletin board beside the diner's register. It read, "One night only, second chances dinner. 6 courses, 1 story. Saturday, 7 p.m. No logos, no sponsors. Just Jonah's name, and the words, 'Seats are limited. Hearts open.'" Loretta stared at it like it might bite her. "You sure this isn't some Vance stunt?" Jonah shook his head. "No press, no politics, just food and the people who still believe something small can mean something big." She didn't nod, but she didn't take it down either. That Saturday, Loretta's grill didn't look like itself. The fluorescent lights stayed off, replaced by old string bulbs someone dug out of a barn. The tables, usually lined with ketchup bottles and laminated menus, wore mismatched cloths and tea candles in jelly jars. The jukebox was silent. The kitchen, too, because tonight the cooking would be done in front of them. Jonah stood behind a makeshift counter, apron stained with tomato and thyme. 6 burners, 1 helper, a beat-up playlist of handwritten recipes taped to the wall behind him. As the clock struck 7, a soft bell rang, and the first guest stepped in. Old couples, a pair of local teachers, 3 veterans from the VFW post, a man in a suit who said nothing but kept checking the time, and surprisingly, Loretta, seated in the corner, arms crossed, unreadable. The first dish came out, a tiny cup of soup, but not just any soup, the one Jonah's mother made with just carrots, onion, and cream when they were too broke for groceries. "Survival broth," she called it. The room went quiet. Second course, toast with roasted mushrooms and black pepper. A nod to the time Jonah tried to impress a girl in 10th grade and set off the school fire alarm. He told that story while he plated, and for the first time, people laughed with him, not at him. The third, rotini with the now perfected sauce. The same dish he cooked for his mother in her weakest hour. He served it without saying a word. The silence said enough. Fourth, braised short rib on a potato puree. A tribute to the shift workers, the night janitors, and the line cooks who taught him to season before they taught him to speak. Fifth, a salad with wild greens and burnt lemon. Bitter, sharp, and cleansing. He called it regret, served cold. Someone near the back whispered, "Damn," and lifted their fork like it was a toast. And the sixth, a simple peach tart, slightly scorched at the edge, with whipped cream that was just beginning to fall. He called it not perfect, but enough. When he placed the last dish, Jonah finally looked up. Eyes met eyes across the room. Strangers who weren't strangers anymore. "I don't know if this dinner changes anything," he said, "but maybe it reminds us that broken things can feed people too." From the corner, Loretta stood slowly. She didn't speak, but she raised her fork, and then quietly, like the hush before a storm shifts into something kinder. Others followed. In that moment, the diner wasn't just a place where eggs sizzled and politics snarled. It was for one night, a room where a life could be tasted in 6 small chapters, and maybe, just maybe, forgiven in return. The chairs were still warm from the night before. Tea lights had burned to their ends, little wax puddles dotting the tables like frozen tears. Jonah stood behind the counter, wiping down the prep space, slower than usual, as if cleaning away the memory too fast might erase what it had meant. Loretta hadn't said much when she left after the 6th dish, just placed a folded napkin beside her plate and walked out into the Ohio dark. Jonah hadn't opened it yet. He wasn't sure he needed to. The bell over the front door rang. He turned, half expecting a regular or maybe someone coming in to ask if the second chances dinner was going to become a thing. But it wasn't that. It was him. J.D. Vance walked in without a suit, without a camera, without the invisible entourage that always seemed to follow men like him. Just dark jeans, a rain-damp jacket, and eyes that looked tired but not weary. He glanced around the empty diner, the twilight leaking through the window like a quiet apology. Then walked to the same booth he had tried to sit in weeks ago, the one near the far corner, beneath the humming clock. This time, no one told him to leave. Jonah didn't rush. He pulled on a clean apron, washed his hands twice, then stepped into the kitchen. He knew exactly what to make. 15 minutes later, he placed the plate in front of J.D. 2 golden salmon corn cakes, crisp on the edges, resting atop a swirl of lemon aioli. A side of shaved cabbage, pickled just enough to cut through the weight. No garnish, just the meal. J.D. looked down, smiled faintly, then picked up his fork. One bite, then another. For a while, nothing else. Then he set the fork down gently, folded his hands and looked up. "This isn't redemption," he said. His voice was low even. "Redemption means someone else had to forgive you. I don't think you needed that." Jonah didn't answer, just listened. "This," J.D. continued, tapping the side of the plate, "this is recognition of everything you already carried and everything no one saw." The words sat there between them, not heavy, not light, just true. Jonah took a deep breath. "Why did you come back?" J.D. looked around. "Because sometimes the only way to fix what you broke is to sit where you didn't get to sit the first time and taste what you missed." Jonah nodded. "I almost didn't make that dish last night. Thought it might feel like pandering." "It didn't," J.D. said. "It felt like a beginning." They sat in silence after that. Not awkward, respectful. Like 2 men watching a bridge finally built where once there was only a gap no one dared cross. As J.D. rose to leave, he pulled something from his jacket, a small envelope. He slid it across the table. "No pressure," he said. "Just possibilities." Then he walked out. Jonah stood still for a moment, then opened the envelope. Inside, a single sentence on Vance Foundation letterhead. "You wrote your application with 6 plates. We just want to see what the next chapter tastes like." Jonah smiled. Not wide, not loud, but deep. He looked around the diner. Candles melted down, plates stacked, chairs tucked. Everything looked the same, but everything had changed. And this time, the man in the booth had finished his meal. By dawn, the headlines had already multiplied. Senator denied service at local diner, returns for one last bite. Blue Collar Boy makes a meal that changes everything. Loretta's Grill, the restaurant that refused power. Talk shows argued. Podcasts speculated. Hashtags trended and twisted. Was it political defiance or just a town tired of being used as someone else's stage? Cable networks pulled old footage of J.D. Vance's stump speeches and paired them with grainy clips of the diner's flickering neon sign. Everyone wanted to own the narrative, to declare what it all meant, what side it stood for, what symbol it now carried. But inside the kitchen, Jonah moved like none of it existed. He diced onions in rhythm, the same way he always had. The hiss of oil on the flat top, the steam rising in clouds, the weight of the pan in his hand. Those were the only truths that mattered. A reporter had called him that morning. Then another, and another. By lunch, a van from D.C. had parked across the street, antenna rising into the overcast sky like a periscope sniffing for scandal. Loretta had muttered something about circus tents, rolled her eyes, and gone out the back door. Jonah stayed. He took orders, poured coffee, chopped celery. The sauce was different now. Not the same one he made after J.D. left, but it carried the same quiet defiance. He didn't write the recipe down, not because it was a secret, but because it was a memory, and memories don't live on paper. A customer slid into a booth, a trucker, big hands, tired face. "You the kid who made that meal for the senator?" he asked. Jonah didn't look up. "I'm the kid who made a meal," the trucker smiled. "Well, whatever you did, my eggs taste better now." Jonah gave a small nod and turned back to the kitchen. No photos, no interviews, just flame and steel. Later, someone left a note on the counter. No name. It read, "You didn't just cook for him. You cooked for the rest of us too." By mid-afternoon, the wind outside picked up. Clouds hung low, heavy with Midwestern moodiness, the kind of sky that made you think of old regrets and second chances. Jonah stood by the back door, apron streaked, arms crossed. He wasn't avoiding the noise. He just had no use for it. Loretta came out from the storage room, held the latest newspaper aloft. A full spread. Jonah's photo from behind, plating a dish, face blurred by motion. The headline read, "I don't cook for applause. I cook to be heard." She didn't say anything, just set it down on the counter beside the tip jar, then quietly walked back to her office and closed the door. Jonah stared at the paper. The quote was real. He'd said it offhand when a reporter outside asked what he wanted from all of this. He hadn't meant it as a slogan. He meant it as a fact. Because no matter who J.D. Vance was, or what he had done before or after that night, Jonah had seen a man walk in alone, without a script, and walk out without bitterness. And that, more than the headlines or hashtags, had stayed with him. In the kitchen, the timer buzzed. Jonah turned off the flame. One more plate. One more chance to speak, without raising his voice. And outside, the storm rolled over the hills. But inside, the fire was his. Controlled, steady, and alive. The soup didn't look special. It didn't steam theatrically in the bowl, or come plated with foam, smoke, or garnish. It wasn't French, wasn't reinvented. Just carrots, lentils, browned garlic, and slow-simmered stock. Stirred with a patience Jonah had learned the hard way. He set the first bowl down in front of a man in a torn flannel, added a folded note beside it, and walked away. Then another, and another. Each bowl went out with the same small envelope. Tucked inside was a handwritten message on plain cardstock. "I made this for someone who couldn't eat. It fed both of us." The first customer didn't say anything. He just read it slowly, set it down, and finished the soup in silence. But the second wiped her eyes after reading it. She didn't ask for more, didn't speak. Just pulled out a napkin and wrote something back, folding it and tucking it beneath her empty bowl. That night, something shifted in the diner. It wasn't in the lighting, which remained dim and flickery, Not in the chairs, which still creaked and leaned uneven. It was in the air. Thicker somehow, softer. People lingered longer after eating. Conversations stayed hushed. And by closing time, there were over a dozen notes stacked by the register. Some drawings, some quotes, some confessions. The wall by the jukebox, once faded with old song menus and ketchup stains, became something else. A woman named Sandra asked if she could tape her daughter's crayon sketch beside Jonah's note. Then a teenager added his grandfather's poem from Vietnam. A man in a business suit, briefcase still by his shoe, simply wrote, "My wife couldn't eat either." No politics, no headlines, just memory and message. By week's end, the entire wall was layered in paper, words in pen, ink, marker, pencil. Some typed, some hand-scrawled, some framed in plastic, some smeared by the weight of what had to be said. Jonah didn't read them all. He just kept cooking. Because that one dish, served over and over with the same quiet note, had said what he needed to say. He didn't cook for applause, for acclaim, for trending clips on national TV. He cooked to be heard. And in the silence that followed each meal, in the tears that weren't loud, in the thank yous that came with no fanfare. He was finally being heard, and not just by customers. In the back of the room, Loretta watched the wall grow, arms folded, eyes unreadable. She hadn't spoken to Jonah since the dinner, but each night she'd come in to mop or restock napkins, and each time she'd pause in front of the wall. No one saw her tape anything up. But one night near the bottom edge, a single faded photo appeared. A girl with a kitchen towel over her shoulder, standing beside a woman, older, tougher, arms around her waist, smiling without smiling. Jonah didn't ask who they were. He didn't need to. The wall was speaking for everyone now. The clatter of morning prep had barely begun when Loretta entered the back kitchen. Her steps, usually firm and loud, today were hesitant, as though unsure she still belonged to the room she'd ruled for 27 years. Jonah was at the sink, quietly organizing herbs, humming low. He didn't notice her until she laid a small, yellowed envelope on the prep table. "It was his," she said simply. Jonah froze. Slowly he turned and reached for the envelope as if it might break apart in his fingers. Inside was a single recipe card, the corners soft with time. The handwriting was careful but weathered, a mixture of bold flavors and old memories. The dish, sweet corn chowder with smoky bacon jam. At the bottom in small ink it read, "Never got to try this one. Maybe one day." Loretta didn't speak for a while, just looked at the walls, the ceiling, the spatulas she could name by heart. "He wrote that in the last month he was with us. Said it was too bold for the menu, too soft for the critics. I think he was waiting for a sign, something that said it was okay to let someone else carry on." Jonah looked at the card again, then at her. "Why now?" he asked. Loretta didn't flinch. "Because I saw you cook the other night like you had something to say, and that's the only reason to cook, really. Not to impress, to speak." A silence passed between them, not empty, but full, heavy with the weight of things unsaid and the relief of finally saying them. "I've been angry, Jonah," Loretta admitted, voice low. "Not because you were leaving, not because of JD, but because somewhere along the way, I stopped believing that passing things on meant they'd survive. I thought, if I wasn't holding it all together, it'd fall apart." Jonah met her eyes. "You held it together for a long time. Maybe now it's time to let someone else build with what you've kept." Loretta gave a short laugh. "I still don't like that man, Vance, but maybe it wasn't about him, huh?" Jonah nodded. "It never was." He held up the card. "Can I add something to it?" "You'd better," she said, smiling for the first time in days. "Just don't mess it up too much." That bacon jam was his pride. Later that night, the chowder was served to 10 regulars and 2 strangers who'd wandered in from out of town. It wasn't just good, it was memory brought back to life. Smoky, sweet, with a quiet heat that lingered. The handwritten recipe was pinned to the diner's back wall, but underneath it, in Jonah's ink, was a new line. A dish unfinished, now spoken in a new voice. Loretta stood back as customers smiled, asked questions, scribbled messages on napkins, and pinned them to the wall of notes. She didn't feel replaced. She felt remembered, echoed, continued. The diner didn't belong to her anymore. Not fully, but it didn't have to. Not if the next hands that shaped it did so with respect, heart, and fire. Before locking up that night, Loretta placed a single sticky note beside her late husband's recipe. It read, "Flame past. Cook boldly." Loretta didn't plan to speak. Not tonight. But after the last plate had been cleared, after Jonah's final soup had stirred something deeper than appetite, she found herself standing in the dim glow of the empty diner. J.D. Vance was still there. He hadn't said much during the evening. Just observed, listened, nodded politely. Now he was nursing a cup of cold coffee, ready to leave without a word. She didn't let him. "You want to know why I didn't serve you that day?" she asked, her voice low but steady. J.D. looked up. There was no defensiveness in his eyes, only a quiet readiness. He didn't interrupt. "My husband's name was Miles," she began. "He opened this place after the plant shut down. Said it would be his way of feeding the ones left behind. For a while it worked." She looked around the room like she was seeing ghosts. But then came the policies, deregulation, a tax change that favored the top and squeezed the bottom. The small guys like Miles, we got swallowed. He spent the last years of his life fighting to keep this place open while watching national leaders call it a necessary sacrifice. J.D. stayed silent. Loretta's words didn't accuse him directly, but they were weighted with the cost of decisions he once supported. "You weren't the only one," she added, "but your face was on the Sunday segment when Miles went into the hospital. They were debating job cuts and saying some towns won't survive the shift." He looked at me and said, "I guess we're one of them." She paused. "I buried him a month later, and I buried the part of myself that believed people in Washington even remembered our names." J.D.'s knuckles tightened around the mug, but he didn't rebut. He didn't offer spin. Instead, after a long pause, he said simply, "I wasn't there then. But I'm here now." Loretta studied him. Her instinct braced for performance, a gesture to salvage public image. But there was none. Just a man showing up. Late, maybe, but not empty-handed. "I don't forgive easily," she said. "I don't expect you to," J.D. replied. They stood in that silence, two figures from different Americas, joined by a meal that had no political agenda, only truth passed from one set of hands to another. From the kitchen, Jonah's laughter echoed faintly, probably teasing one of the waitresses. For a moment, it reminded her of how Miles used to laugh, that full-bodied sound that filled this place when dreams still seemed possible. Loretta turned toward J.D. again, her voice softer now. "He would have liked Jonah. Kid's got fire." J.D. nodded. "He reminds me of why I got into this in the first place, before the noise." And then, just before J.D. left, Loretta added something she hadn't planned. "I was wrong to let my anger speak louder than my service. Not because of who you are, but because of who I am." J.D. nodded once. No victory, no forgiveness, just understanding. She didn't stop him when he reached the door. But as he stepped outside into the cool night, she whispered something to herself that Miles used to say whenever things felt too broken to fix. "Sometimes the flame comes back, just not in the place you expect." The diner wasn't open to the public that night. No cameras, no curious onlookers pressing their faces against foggy windows. Just 4 people, a worn wooden table, and a meal that didn't come with a price. Jonah had insisted on cooking, not to impress, not to prove anything, but because it was the only language he truly trusted. He worked quietly, sleeves rolled up, the kitchen light spilling warmth across the cracked tile floor as he plated each dish with care. Loretta brought out the chipped plates herself. Eliza, the sharp-witted motel owner who had once handed Jonah leftover soup in a coffee cup, sat at the end of the table, still in her work apron. J.D. was already seated, hands folded loosely, eyes following Jonah's every move with a quiet curiosity. No one rushed. There were no toasts, just the first course. A thick, rustic corn chowder Jonah had once made for his mother when she couldn't keep anything else down. He didn't explain it. He just served it. They ate slowly. The only sound was the clink of spoons and the soft scrape of chairs. And yet, it wasn't awkward. The silence felt full somehow, like it was carrying things they didn't need to say out loud anymore. Halfway through the meal, JD broke the silence. Not with a speech, just a simple gesture. He raised his bowl slightly toward Jonah and said, "This tastes like someone remembered." Jonah gave a small nod, unsure how to respond. But inside, a knot that had been sitting in his chest for months loosened, just enough to let something unfamiliar in. Not pride exactly, but something close to peace. Eliza leaned back in her chair and laughed softly. "You know, if someone told me last week I'd be eating dinner with a senator, a line cook, and the most stubborn woman in 3 counties, I'd have asked what they were drinking." Loretta cracked a smile. "And if you told me I'd let him back through that door, I'd have kicked you out myself." JD chuckled. "You still might." The laughter wasn't loud, but it was real, and for a moment it felt like the place itself exhaled. The booths, the floor, even the old jukebox by the window, all remembering what it was like to hold something human and warm. Between courses, Jonah brought out something unexpected, a loaf of cornbread he'd baked from Loretta's husband's old recipe. He hadn't changed a thing, just followed the faded pencil notes like a map. He placed it at the center of the table without a word. Loretta stared at it for a long moment before tearing off a piece and passing it around. JD tasted it, nodded, then looked at Loretta. "He's still here," he said. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The final dish was simple: fried apples with a dollop of cream and a dusting of cinnamon. Sweet, not flashy. It was a dish meant for sharing. And they did. Elbow to elbow, passing the bowl, biting into warmth. When the plates were empty and the coffee poured, they lingered. No rush to leave. The diner's clock ticked on, unnoticed. JD leaned back and said quietly, "Maybe this is what we forgot, that you don't fix a country in speeches. You fix it in rooms like this. One meal, one voice, one story at a time." Jonah didn't reply, but he met JD's eyes. Not as a supporter, not as a skeptic, just as someone who'd seen the man arrive in silence and stay long enough to listen. The silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel cold or unfinished. It felt like a page finally turned. And in that small-town diner, the kind with peeling booths and a jukebox that hadn't played in years, 4 people sat together, not as sides but as survivors, of loss, of assumptions, of time. And somehow that felt like enough. The next morning the diner was quiet again. The second chances dinner had passed, but its warmth lingered. Not just in the air, but in the way Jonah moved. There was no rush in his steps, no cloud over his brow. Just a calm awareness, like something inside him had settled. He was wiping down the counter when Eliza walked in from the rain, carrying an old envelope. Her hair was tucked under a scarf, her boots dripping, but her eyes, sharp as ever, held something gentler than usual. "You got a minute?" she asked. Jonah nodded, drying his hands on a towel. Eliza placed the envelope on the counter with care, almost reverence. "Found this last night, digging through old donation records. It's from a church kitchen program. Year must have been 94 or so." She slid the contents toward him, a black and white photo, slightly curled at the edges. Jonah took a breath as he looked down. The image was grainy, but clear enough. A line of women in aprons standing behind a fold-out table filled with casseroles and pots. In the middle, unmistakably, was his mother. Younger, brighter, laughing with her head tilted back. And beside her, just slightly turned but smiling, was another woman, her face older now in memory, but recognizable. "Is that?" Jonah asked, his voice almost breaking. Eliza nodded. JD's mother, Beverly. They cooked together back then. Part of a community effort to feed struggling families during the layoffs. Jonah stared at the photograph, the past folding in on itself like layers of pastry. He'd always known his mother had volunteered at food drives, but she rarely spoke of the people she worked with. It hadn't seemed important. And now suddenly, it was everything. "I never knew," he whispered. Eliza leaned on the counter, arms crossed gently. "None of us did. They went separate ways. Your mom stayed. JD's mom left, chasing something else. But for a while, They were side by side, stirring the same pots, feeding the same neighbors. Jonah looked back at the photo. He could almost hear them laughing. Two young women with flour on their sleeves and fire in their hearts, believing, maybe just for a while, that food could hold broken things together. He turned the photo over, a note scribbled in pen. "To the next table will serve." The words struck him like a bell rung in his chest. The next table wasn't a promise to others. It was a torch, passed silently through time. "They never met again?" he asked. Eliza shook her head. "Not that I know of, but maybe that's not the point. Maybe the point is, now their kids have." The truth sat quietly between them. No need for fanfare. Jonah felt something shift again. Not the roar of transformation, but the slow rethreading of meaning. His story hadn't started in the diner. It hadn't even started with him. It started with women who chose to serve long before the world ever noticed. Jonah placed the photo inside a clean frame and walked to the wall of notes where customers had pinned their drawings, scribbled quotes, and half-crumpled memories. He added the photo right in the center, beneath the message from his soup. "I made this for someone who couldn't eat. It fed both of us." Then in careful script, he added a new line below the photo. "Two mothers. One recipe for hope." Behind him, Eliza smiled and left without a word. And in the quiet that followed, Jonah didn't feel small. He didn't feel lost. He felt placed, not as a chef, not as a symbol, but as a bridge between what was and what could still be. 1 year later, the smell of caramelized onions and fresh thyme floated through the air, where meatloaf once ruled and politics once cracked like thunder. But now the old Loretta's grill looked different. The neon sign was still there, Loretta's, glowing faintly above the awning. But inside it had become something else entirely. Polished countertops gleamed under soft lighting. Knives were aligned like instruments on magnetic strips. A row of clean white aprons hung beneath cubbies labeled with first names: Tina, Marcus, Noor, Jamal. At the far end of the room, near what used to be the pie display case, a wide mural filled the wall, a table set with 6 dishes, and beneath it, bold black letters, "Where second chances are plated daily." Jonah stood in front of a group of 12 students. Most were older than him. A few had worn jumpsuits not long ago. One was a single mother from the shelters downstate. Another had never finished high school. They all looked nervous. And so, honestly, did he. He smoothed his apron, cleared his throat, and smiled. "You're not here to be perfect," he said. "You're here to be present, and to believe, like I had to, that just because something broke doesn't mean it's done." He paused, watching their eyes shift from uncertainty to a flicker of curiosity. "This used to be a diner," he continued, motioning to the floor beneath them. "People sat right here pouring coffee into silence. Some came to remember, some came to forget. I came to survive." He didn't say much more than that. He didn't mention J.D. Vance. He didn't mention the photo, the soup, or the storm. Those stories were for another time, or maybe not at all. What mattered now was who stood in front of him, wearing aprons with hands calloused by more than just kitchen work. Their first assignment was simple. "Make me something you loved as a kid," Jonah said, placing a crate of assorted ingredients on the prep table. "Doesn't have to be fancy, just honest." The room came alive with the rustle of sleeves, the clatter of cutting boards, and the hum of burners igniting. As Jonah walked between them, correcting a grip here, encouraging a stir there, a woman named Tina tapped him on the shoulder. "Chef Jonah," she asked shyly, "how did you know when you were ready?" He looked at her for a moment, then to the stove, then back. "You don't," he replied. "You just start feeding people anyway." Laughter spread lightly through the group. Something loosened in the room. From the window, the sun poured through in quiet patches, landing on the mural and the steel countertops. And Jonah felt a warmth he hadn't known in years. Not just the heat of the kitchen, but the heat of purpose. Behind the wall, in the office now lined with books and recipes, sat the same black and white photo Eliza had given him. His mother and JD's mother, smiling over bowls they served with hope. Beneath it was a sticky note he'd added recently. "They didn't finish their story, but maybe I get to." The bell above the door jingled and Loretta stepped in. She didn't say anything, just nodded at Jonah, then made her way to the back where she sometimes helped with admin work, and sometimes just watched. He smiled. She was still part of it all, and maybe always would be. In the kitchen, the first pots of the first class began to simmer. Jonah took a deep breath, grabbed a tasting spoon, and walked toward the steam. Class had begun, and for the first time in a long time, the only thing louder than the past was what came next. They didn't want another cooking show, no firecracker personalities, no surprise eliminations, no ticking clocks. What the producers came for, and what Jonah offered, was something quieter. Something that didn't chase ratings but invited reflection. The show didn't have a flashy name, just Cook to Live. Simple, like the kitchen it was filmed in. Each episode was set in the old Loretta's diner, now converted into Jonah's teaching space. No sets, no scripts, just Jonah, a few students, and the day's lesson. Sometimes it was stew, sometimes it was bread, sometimes it was just how to slice an onion without flinching. But it wasn't about the food. The pilot episode opened with Jonah standing at the counter, sunlight coming in sideways, hands still from habit and humility. A voiceover played softly. When you've had to earn back your own name, you learn to cook with more than salt. One of his students that day was a teenage boy named Malik, 16, silent, wary. He hadn't spoken more than 2 words since arriving. Jonah didn't press. He handed Malik a bunch of parsley and a clean knife, and for 20 minutes they just chopped. By the time the broth was boiling, Malik finally whispered, "My brother used to make this." Jonah nodded. "We'll make it right then." That moment wasn't edited. It aired just like that. No applause, no music swell. Just 2 people letting food say what words couldn't. The show grew quietly, like yeast in a covered bowl. It began airing regionally, then picked up by a national network. Viewers didn't just watch. They sent letters. Veterans, former inmates, grandparents raising grandkids. They didn't care about camera angles. They cared about someone finally showing what starting over actually looked like. In one episode, Jonah taught a girl how to roll dough for hand pies. She asked him, "Is this really cooking?" He smiled, eyes warm. "If it fills your belly and reminds you who you are, then yeah, it's cooking." At the end of every episode, the camera would linger on the final plate, steam rising softly. Jonah would look directly into the lens, not like a host, but like a neighbor leaning across a shared table. His voice, steady and unpolished, would close each show the same way. "I see you, and I saved you a plate." It was never about saving the world, just reminding it that no one should have to eat their dignity cold. Steam curls gently from a pot as Jonah stirs with calm, steady hands. The kitchen hums with soft voices, the scrape of metal on ceramic, the quiet rhythm of a life no longer rushing to prove itself. A young woman calls out from across the room, asking about seasoning. Jonah doesn't answer right away. He walks over, dips a spoon, and nods. She tastes, eyes widening in surprise. Laughter echoes, not loud, but real. It doesn't bounce off studio walls. It fills a place that once served short orders and silent judgments. Now, it teaches and heals. The camera drifts through the school, past rows of students in aprons, some young, some gray-haired, all learning the same thing, that food isn't just for filling bellies. It's for stitching broken stories. Jonah's voice begins, low and steady. "I wasn't denied a meal. I was given a story." Jonah helping a student plate a dish with trembling hands, hugging Loretta on a quiet morning, watching a kid write their name on a take-home recipe card and underline it twice, like it finally meant something. Most people think second chances are given by others, but the truth is, they're taken, quietly, when no one's watching, when you decide you're worth it. The camera lingers on the back room, once a cramped storage area, now a framed gallery of memories, letters, napkins, photos of students and dishes and families. In the center, under soft light, a single white napkin in a frame. The ink is slightly smudged but still legible. "You have more in you than you think." J.D. Jonah's voice barely above a whisper now. "And now, I pass it on. Dish by dish." Cut to Jonah walking out the door at dusk, locking up. He pauses, looks back at the sign on the window. Loretta's grill is still faintly visible beneath the new words. The second table. School of Culinary Renewal. He smiles, not like someone who won, like someone who stayed. The final image is a plate, simple, humble. A folded card beside it reads, "Reserved for whoever needs it most." This story reminds us that dignity isn't something you're handed. It's something you quietly reclaim. Jonah was never after headlines or applause. He just wanted to matter, to cook something that tasted like hope, and in doing so, he gave others permission to dream again. The power of this journey lies not in fame or fortune, but in the quiet revolution of being seen and seeing others in return. Sometimes healing doesn't come from grand speeches, but from a bowl of soup and a second chance. What's one quiet gift someone once gave you? And did you ever get the chance to pass it on? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.